Hey, what's up? This is Wilsfer with Abysmal Hymns. I got Keith Chackles from Ghost Cult Magazine with me, and we're going to talk about classic rock, our top five classic rock bands, meaning they came out before 1977, and why they're so important to music today. Because we always talk about a lot of like new music, and that's the focus in what we do at Ghost Cult a lot of the times, but bands that have stood the test of time are pretty important. So shoot for it, Keith. Who you got?
Well, hopefully you didn't choose me for this because I'm some kind of fucking boomer compared to you. I am old enough to have seen some of the bands that are cool, and young enough at heart to still keep my fat thumb on the pulse of shit. I like to think so, at least. I think, as you know, being a music journalist, you kind of have to be a generalist. And I was a little kid in the '70s, and came of my own musical, you know, my own proclivities in the '80s when I discovered different types of things: pop music, thrash metal, hardcore, New York hardcore, punk, all kinds of things. So I had a very eclectic upbringing. But first of all, thanks for having me. And thank you so much for coming on to Ghost Cult. You've been amazing since you came to us, and one of the more consistent people I know I can count on. Your opinions are always your own, and I really appreciate that. They're always, based on work and education and your knowledge of stuff. So yeah, I'm still one of those guys where classic rock is still important to me, and the history of music is still very important to me. So I'm glad you're doing this. I checked out some of your other episodes, and very, very tickled pink to be here today. Not just pink in the background lighting, but actual pink. Um, are we doing like a top number
Yeah,
one
give
to
me what
five?
we're not doing them in order, just whatever. We're
Yeah,
going off our five favorite classic rock bands. There's going to be some
sure.
overlap, I'm sure I know with two of them, maybe all
Right.
of them. Who knows?
Yeah. Who
I might
knows?
have a
It's
wild
true.
card in here because I'm choosing there's two that aren't necessarily bands, but dudes that have
Yeah.
bands. So
I felt like the bands are artists, or yeah, that's fine. For me, everything begins and ends with my favorite band of all time, which happens to be Pink Floyd. And not just Pink Floyd, what everybody knows as Pink Floyd, the big '70s hit records, but actually all of Pink Floyd. I think except for the Endless River, which was a mistake to put out, but I think they were trying to put money in Rick Wright's family's pocket after 35 years or 40 years of dishonor because of Roger. And Roger being, what he is, not a great person, but he was a brilliant songwriter in his day and an excellent bass player. I love Pink Floyd. I love Pink Floyd all eras. I was actually hesitant to do Pink Floyd as a series on my own podcast, the Glacial Musical Podcast, in addition to the Ghost Cult podcast, because me and the co-host Floyd is his favorite band. The Wall is his favorite album. And I was like, we're just going to be like arcing ropes of jism on this thing. And it's not going to be like constructive or conducive for listeners. But we finally came around to landing in a place where it was like, okay, we can't really have this podcast and not have a Pink Floyd series or four. So I think that's what we're doing. We did the early years of Pink Floyd with Sid. I love the soundtrack space rock era, which then they went for years fighting against that, the live band versus the studio band versus the creative force. And then they allowed Roger to take over the band. Let's face it, he's a better lyricist than anybody else in the band. And his contrast of his voice versus David Gilmour and Rick Wright together was, unhinged and wonderful in all the best ways. And then I even like the other Floyd records, the post Roger era, again, except for Endless River, has some magical moments. So that's my number one favorite, and my number. I think they are the best band of all time in terms of rock music for all the variety of reasons. They've been so copied, so emulated. Their studio stuff has been emulated. Alan Parsons, no disrespect, but for a guy who was an engineer on a couple of pretty amazing records, has spent his entire career as a solo artist copying the stuff that he did, as a part of something else, took that entire thing and made it his identity. Shout out to him for doing the most obvious low hanging fruit thing. But Floyd is it for me. Number one, two, three, four, and five, if anything.
All right, cool. They're definitely one of mine. So one of mine are knocked out. My favorite Pink Floyd album is Animals.
Nice.
I
It's
think it's
Animals or Wish You Were Here for me.
a good blend. It would be Animals, and then probably after that, Obscured by Clouds.
I love
Um,
Obscure Clouds. Obscure
so,
Clouds. Oh, love it so
so that
much.
would be a another. It's not even neck and neck with Animals. It would be definitely Obscured by Clouds. After that one, then probably Wish You Were Here.
I love Wish You Were
Um,
Here. That's my favorite. I would say
it
Obscured
feels
by
like more of a
Clouds has,
jam. It feels like more of a jam if you
yeah,
compare it to like Animals. Is definitely like very almost proggy in how it's arranged, and like it
yeah.
feels more like movements. And then on the other side of the coin, you got The Wall, which is like a huge musical. Um, Wish You Were Here feels more intimate to me. So.
I like that. That's absolutely true. I always consider Obscured by Clouds kind of like Dark Side of the Moon with training wheels. It's the pre. It's like let's try out all these things, and then they perfected it a few years later. So I love Obscured, but La Vallée, as they say in French, which I speak badly. I can't speak actually at all, but love Obscured by Definitely like that's my one, two, three. Like the Wish You Were Here, Animals, Obscured by Clouds, Dark Side, probably Metal, The Walls in there too. I also had a Pink Floyd tribute band at one point. That was the last working band that I had at one point, and now I started a new band recently where I'm doing music again. But none
Cool.
of it will be Pink Floydy.
I guess if I had to pick a top, it's hard to say. Probably David Bowie is going to be mine. He has so many stages and phases. We forget that at his essence, he was really just a rock guy. Like the whole 70s body of work stacks up against all other bands, I think, when he's playing with the Spiders from Mars. He does go off on some tangents, with Low and stuff like that when he hooks up with Robert Fripp, but he's one of those guys that I'm glad that he died when he did because everything is like framed perfectly. I never have to worry about David Bowie putting out a bad album. So the closest he came to that was probably Sound of White Noise, but you know, I can live with it. It's good. It's
Yeah,
all good.
I'm not glad he died, but I or when he did or anything, I'm not okay with it. But I know what you're saying. I think like he had one of the most interesting careers of anybody. I think his inability to sit still creatively has been unrivaled almost. Um, and he's also like people don't even realize they're doing stuff he did already,
Right.
and no, I don't acknowledge like YouTube videos about how many riffs Metallica stole with that one riff from Bowie that sounds like the Master of Puppets E riff. Like I don't care, bro. Like I
Right.
don't care. But Bowie is copied and regenerated and emulated over and over and over. And hey, let's give some credit to Madonna, who basically based her entire career on David Bowie changing every year, and
Right.
that's what she
True.
tried to do. And with much less talent and a lot of chutzpah and dancing ability and a little bit of voice, she did a whole lot to throw up the horns and pay tribute to Bowie in her own way. And Gaga has done that, and other people in the modern lexicon of music that's pop music and not rock or metal.
Sure, and David Bowie also like brought in so many musicians to the spotlight, from Stevie Ray Vaughan to Iggy Pop to Luther Vandross, who's just a backup singer on Young Americans. We don't really realize like the kind of ear for talent that he had. So yeah, so that's one of mine. Who do you got next?
Uh, have to be Zeppelin. And I know that they're much maligned and derided, and every chance I can that I say something good about Led Zeppelin, somebody pops up in the comments and they're like, Jimmy Page, sloppy. Jimmy Page, kidnapped the 14-year-old. Jimmy Page, mugshot. And I think the two things you have to look at is the legend of Led Zeppelin is not the same thing as the actual quality of the band. So we're talking about, granted, he had, I don't know if you saw the Becoming Led Zeppelin documentary. It was marvelous. Granted, it's like, Antoine Fisher written and directed and starring Antoine Fisher, but it's kind of like, it is the Dave Chappelle story. It is Led Zeppelin, told by them. But I think, obviously with especially Pagey and Jones having been prolific studio musicians and playing on countless classic songs and not just, everything you can possibly imagine that came out of the 60s, they had a little bit of fingertip on. These guys were like the Avengers assemble of a band, right? And whether it's like Plant's raw talent, Bottom being just an unbelievable monster drummer, still top 4 or 5 drummer ever in classic rock. 45 years after he died. And 46 years after they played what really is their last show, if you don't want to count that, the comeback thing. And Page and Plant is still not Led Zeppelin, but they were just so unbelievable. I often say that if Zeppelin had stopped, even though those first 2 records are barely original, right? If they had stopped after those first 2 records, they still would be one of the greatest bands ever. And they didn't stop. They went on and on and on. And I'll throw out Stairway to Heaven and throw away certain things and say that run from Zoso to the end is still hard to rival. So I love Zeppelin on a level most people don't comprehend. And I still hear things, much like with Floyd. I hear things in the Zeppelin records today that sound fresh. Like, oh, I didn't notice that third guitar harmony. I didn't notice that Plant backwards tape echo that they copied from Glenn Johns when he worked with the Stones. Like, you know, Jimmy the producer, Jimmy the songwriter, Jimmy the arranger, is much more complete and comprehensive than Jimmy just the blues interpreter that all his peers were, right? He went away from that. And I think if Bonham hadn't died, probably they would have called it a day at some point, but you never know what was possible or capable with them, which I think is wonderful. Like anything is possible, right? And so many bands have followed in their footsteps for better or worse.
Right, but I mean, I think that's the thing. Like with something like Led Zeppelin, who would be another one of my top five, I knew that's where the overlap was going to be for sure. You know, at least like Tall Cool One didn't get carried over into the album that was going to come after Presence or something like that. So all their body of work is like perfectly wrapped up with a bow. And they knew when, even though that was the situation with Bonham, they knew when to take their bow. Everybody goes and does their own thing. And the mythology of Zeppelin is what keeps them as, one of my favorite bands. I mean, you got Page's interest in the occult and, how he owned Crowley's mansion, that darker side of Led Zeppelin is what I'm definitely into. And, that just goes to show they have such a massive mythology that you could like be into Led Zeppelin, the blues guys, or you could be into Led Zeppelin, the creepy prog guys that, made physical graffiti while they were high out of their minds, which is goes to show that, if they can do that in that state, they could have done anything, musically at least. And Page was like so groundbreaking with like mic placement techniques and stuff like that. How they would like have Robert Plant all the way down a stairwell singing and stuff like that. So, Zeppelin is yeah, they're hard to beat. They've always in my high school battles with friends about who's the greatest band, I would always play devil's advocate and argue somebody against them, but in my heart, I was like, what am I even saying here? So yeah, so that's one. So my other one, which is going to be maybe a wild card from left field, is Frank Zappa, and he's the Mothers of Invention technically is a band, but oh God, what think about the music that would not exist without Frank Zappa. I mean, he taught Jimi Hendrix how to use a wah wah pedal. So back when he was in a doo wop group, and I think that he's another guy who's made his mission with music and just drifted on into the great beyond as it should have been. I don't think Frank Zappa would have been making music in today's climate. As soon as AI started doing it, he would have checked out somehow.
I think he would have checked out with the iPod. I think the
Right.
digitization
Yeah.
of music, he didn't like the CD that much. He didn't want a laserdisc player. He did not like all the commoditization of music, especially the rights grabs of the major labels. I think he would have went very DIY. He would have been conducting symphony orchestras, like a similar to a Jazz Coleman, right? Like very avant-garde, underground stuff, and went far away from his roots. But I love Zappa. I love Zappa as a kid. I think if we were doing a top 20 or 15, Zappa's in there for me. And again, like I understand bands and again, Bowie, an artist still needs a band behind them to carry out their vision. So all good to me. I'm not gonna get split hairs over that stuff. Zappa's immense. I mean, like, and again, eras, right? Different eras, different frolicking along genre lines, and he put so many people on. He's really responsible. Him and Hendrix, as much as a Van Halen or Rhodes, are responsible for Guitar Hero worship. Like really, not like transcended blues and into other things. And unfortunately, also all you jam band people out there,
Yeah.
as my British friends say, need to get in the sea.
Jam
Um,
bands would not exist without Frank Zappa. And I think, even the guys from Fish would like admit that, because I always thought Fish owed more to Frank Zappa than they did the Grateful Dead.
yeah, for sure. I think if I could torture anybody or any band with impunity against the Convention rules and extradite them to a black site and hurt them without end, it would be Fish. I definitely would want to physically hurt those guys. Even Mike Keneally, who I'm sure is a sweetheart. I fucking don't care. They should be injured and never recover for what they've done to humanity.
Not my thing, but I guess it's working for somebody. The drugs must be good. Who do
The
you got
drugs are
next?
good. Um, you know, I could not be the metalhead that I am without Black Sabbath. I remember running around in my tidy whities and my underoos, listening to the beginning of War Pigs. And between that and Kiss, I knew what I was going to do with my life, and Zeppelin and things like that. I had to play bass and sing maybe, and you know, uh, Sabbath and to other extent, other artists of that era really laid the groundwork for everything I love today. Anything that's heavy, severely underrated, groovy band. I know Ozzy gets a lot of shit. People want to compare Ozzy to Dio. Ozzy's a terrible singer. Ozzy is the voice of metal. Ozzy is the first person to bring those lyrics from Geezer Butler to life. And even before his solo career, there is no Sabbath with Dio if there is not a Sabbath with Ozzy. And they were all fucked up on drugs, and for them to fire Ozzy seems insane now if you think about how much coke Iommi did in the '80s and all the drugs they were doing. But yeah, what can you say, man? Just an absolutely perfect band with a great run of albums. You just need those first six albums. Honestly, some of those records are not good through and through, but that could be said of a lot of bands. By the time they didn't really have money, but by the time they thought they had money, they actually had no money. They thought they were living like they had money, and they didn't realize they weren't. They didn't have any money. But and Ozzy still hooked up with Sharon. Kind of crazy if you think about it. She became her dad, which is wild, right? That she literally followed in his footsteps. Uh, One of the most evil music managers ever. And but what a phenomenal band! I'm still finding things today that I love about those Sabbath records. When it all comes down to it, Ozzy, set the template. He wasn't a Robert Plant. He tried to sing out of his body on some of those things that probably somebody should have said, it's not such a great idea for you to do. Supernaut and Hole in the Sky So High. It's not really fit for your range. But I love that he tried. He had a good musical ear. Geezer's incredible. Bill Ward is somehow underrated. Iommi is Iommi. Iommi is God. And hail the riff and hail the leaf.
Right. I mean, though, I think that, Ozzy is a good singer. I think that if you listen to like the how he belts it out in that middle section of Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, like Dio didn't do that. Like Dio has more control and is a different style singer. I think that Ozzy and Black Sabbath is one of the bands that we crossed over on. So that would be one of mine too. But yet Ozzy has a lot of charisma in his voice, you know. He sells that he's going insane, you know. And that was, a huge part of I think what made metal and Black Sabbath so important is almost like the Charles Manson thing. Like Charles Manson killed the hippie movement and darkened everything up. Black Sabbath showed up as a hippie band, but darkened everything up, maybe intentionally. I mean, they named themselves after a horror movie. Maybe they were getting some bad acid in England. I don't know, but it all worked out like it was supposed to. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if you saw what was the God Bless Ozzy Osbourne, that documentary where he goes home and all that. But yeah, he grew up in a rough working class childhood where, I'm sure he got popped around a lot as a kid and stuff like that, and all that pain and thinking that music is his only way out. Like he said, if he wasn't singing, he would be like in a gang or he would have been in jail. All that pain gets translated in his singing, and that's something you can't fake. Like I always say, you can dial in metal guitar tones, you can throw all the pentagrams on your albums you want, but you can't fake having that inner pain and darkness that you have to project out with that catharsis in your music, and I think that's Ozzy's strength as an artist.
Right on. Two really quick other anecdotes. Not only have I seen God Bless Ozzy Osbourne, I got to interview Ozzy and Jack for God Bless Ozzy Osbourne in a room with a pool of other people. But I attended the Tribeca Film Festival premiere of God Bless Ozzy Osbourne. And I almost had a chance to meet him, but I was spoiled at the last second. And then I want to say one other thing, which is especially prescient for these times, is that, next to Roger and Pink Floyd, and then later on Punk, Black Sabbath is extremely political. They're an extremely revolutionary minded band. Geezer Butler's lyrics was worried of the same fears and cultural, dismay about our leaders and about our state of affairs is very blatant. It's not even couched creatively and lyrically. It's right out in the open about how defiant and how resistance minded that band was. And I don't think a lot of people pay attention to that, how important that was, that a major band was speaking up and speaking out about these things. So maybe they killed the hippies. They wanted to be hippies. Ozzy loved the hippies, but also like this is not Zeppelin. Or really just singing about scoring and then mystical magical shit and nothing actually about the day and the time of the world until much later, if at all. So there's a real hero's journey there in the Black Sabbath music that I think gets overlooked.
Cool. All right, those are mine. I mean, we got for me David Bowie, Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd.
Zappa. So
Yep,
that's three
Zappa.
for me, right? So
Yep. So you got two more.
I got two more. So I think here's my curveball. And for every, it's no surprise if you listen to me do my podcast or write or interview bands. Thin Lizzy. Thin Lizzy is the most underrated major band of all time. They should have been as big as blank, 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 whoever you want to say the next rundown. And I know people are going to argue Queen, and I know people are going to argue other people. Thin Lizzy is so good from about the time they do the Whiskey in the Jar cover, which was revolutionary and incredible culturally for Irish people, phenomenal musically arranged by Eric Bell, who never gets enough talked about and loved because Lizzy had so many great guitar players come through their ranks. Philo is unbelievable as a vocalist and a bass player and an arranger and a songwriter. And that run of records really from Vagabond, maybe after Vagabond to all the way up to Thunder and Lightning or right before it is unreal. And they just could never break in America big enough. I know people love the hit songs. I'm not talking about the hits. I'm talking about the deep cuts. Black Rose, Chinatown, I'm talking about these records. The B sides are as good as anything you have heard. Better, as good or better than Jailbreaks, as good or better than Boys Are Back in Town, as good or better. Cowboy, Emerald, Cowboy Song, Emerald. These are eternal tracks that are unbelievable, and I think it's a definite shame that they didn't get a chance to have kind of a second life and a comeback and get their full freight and respect that they really earned, at least musically. And then this guy is a culturally significant figure. If you're British, Irish, Scottish, Wales, he spoke for the working class. He also was, very political, very talking about the troubles, talking about the times, talking about his growing up being biracial in a very racist time in Europe, and it never ended for him. Like he was constantly trying to, how exhausting must it be to try to constantly assert yourself as a to be taken seriously as a sensitive and smart, interesting guy, and not just a druggy band guy. Like, which again, was maybe his duality, but what a magical voice, what an incredible singer. I would put him up against almost anybody.
Yeah, he certainly has a very honest feel to his voice. I would say so, and Thin Lizzy would be in my top 20. Um, Johnny the Fox is oddly my favorite Thin Lizzy
Love
album.
Johnny the Fox. Yeah,
And it's one of those with not a lot of the hits, and their band kind of like see Thin Lizzy like the Police or Rush, where if you just judge them by their radio songs, you're not really getting a full picture of who they are. Like I'll turn the channel on The Boys Are Back in Town. I don't care about that song, but Cowboy song, yes, you know, for sure.
my favorite. Yeah, it's one of my favorites. Yeah, just unbelievable. And then that again, like the ranks of guys who have come through that band are all masterful. I'm not objecting that they tried to make a comeback. I'm a big Ricky Warwick stan. He's got a recent interview on Ghost Cult's YouTube with Ricky for his new solo record, and he also was like, I'm Irish, so if I fuck this up, the whole country is coming for me. So he took it very seriously when he was in the band. I know Troy from Mastodon has done a stretch in a newer version of Thin Lizzy on both vocals and bass. I know that Scott Gorham is trying to book the band to play like major festivals and stuff for the whatever run out the string for him. He's like 70 something years old, right? 75. So, I'm not mad at it if he puts together kind of an all-star band to do it as a tribute. I don't know that I would want a new Thin Lizzy record at this point
Right.
without Phil, but I respect Scott. It was also his band equally from the time he was in. So I wouldn't hold it against him to try to put the band out and get some kind of, recognition and everything.
All right, who else you got?
And then, the last spot is extremely hard. There's so many I could put in. But I think at the end of the day, you have to look at the body of work and the players involved. And for that, I look at Deep Purple. And I know that they are probably overrated to a lot of people. And I'm not, again, it's a band like you could just take the hits and be like, wow, that's really impressive. Highway Star and My Woman of Tokyo and Hush and obviously Smoke on the Water is the most played guitar riff of all time at a certain point, besides Stairway to Heaven and White Room and things like that. But I also look at that band. They had a lot of firsts that other bands didn't do that followed them. Um, you know, in rock, Machine Head, then with the change of singers and certain band members, they also changed musically. I think Stormbringer is probably their masterpiece album, and that's Coverdale. It's not even Ian Gillan, who I also love in Black Sabbath on that one record, Born Again. And I'm not even the biggest Blackmore person. I think he's a bit of a twat waffle, to be honest with you. Not a fan of him as a person. He was a revolutionary, groundbreaking lead guitar player, and bringing in the classical modes and things like that was interesting. But they were a band that could stand toe to toe with anybody. I also love Rush. I love Queen, although it turns out that Queen's records are not that good, but their hits are incredible. Um, I was a huge progressive rock nerd as a kid, so I also love Yes and King Crimson and ELP and Genesis with Peter Gabriel and later with Phil to all equal measures. So that's a really tough one, but I'd have to give it to Deep Purple with an like a by a nose. And then when Gillan comes back in the band, and they like one of the few bands that was able to make it to the '80s and do a good album, Perfect Strangers, which I think is actually a great album and very underrated, where they didn't really butcher their own sound to stay relevant. I also am going to throw out kind of an honorable mention to Chicago, which I think, especially their pre '80s stuff, is that '60s, '70s stuff is incredible. And then if you just like the radio stuff from the '80s, that's a whole different sounding band that they morphed into. And but they were like gigantic musicians, like giants in the room. Like they could have played with anybody if they wanted to go in whatever different direction. Like those early Chicago records are beautiful. But I love Deep Purple, man. Deep Purple's really like look past those 10 hits could fuck with anybody. But if you go into their catalog and really listen to those records, man, there is some killer writing and playing on those records, just really
Yeah, like
unmatched.
In Rock is probably my favorite Deep Purple album, and they would probably be in my top 22. Like Child in Time, to me, that's like their best song.
Mm,
And I'm a huge Ian Gillan fan because I was super into the Jesus Christ Superstar soundtrack, which he was
nice work.
on. And yeah, so they're another band, like you said, can't judge them by the radio songs. And I like space trucking. I'm not huge on smoking the water. Um, but yeah, most of those bands, your honorable mentions, I definitely can agree with King Crimson. They were another one that I was kind of kicking around. Also, Peter Gabriel era, Genesis. It's just I really everything past Duke. Super not about. Let's see. Also, The Doors. That was another one that was kind of tough for me, but I cannot stand when it sounds like they're having a parade and they get too happy. Even though
That's
I
Ray.
will
That's all
assert that The
Ray. It's not
Doors are
even.
the first goth band,
Jim.
they can get to it just like The Cure. I mean, I'll walk out during Love Cats. That's my bathroom break. Friday I'm in love. Goodbye. I'll see you when we get back to pornography. So similar dynamic, and I know that the Doors and Jimi Hendrix were both very influential on Robert Smith, as with David
Yeah.
Bowie and Pink Floyd for sure. You know,
Yeah, Jimmy was incredible. I'm still hearing things in the Jimmy records that are really untouchable. I do not acknowledge the Alan Douglas re-recorded, recreated Hendrix albums. That's a shame. Always have a will, everybody. Prince, Jimi Hendrix, leave a will
right?
and leave your instructions very like in a lockbox when they can't be refuted, notarized and signatory and everything because people are gonna shit on your legacy even whether you want them to or not. But you can control the narrative if you take care of business. And Jimmy, it was harder for him. There wasn't a music industry back then, right? It was the music
Right.
business. And Prince is also to me, I mean, like Ramones to me are a classic rock band. I've talked about this before. Growing up in New York City, Ramones were on the radio right next to Black Sabbath and Zeppelin because they were our band. They were a New York band. So I didn't even really know what punk was until I was a little older and I understood the punk scene that was happening concurrently. So to me, Ramones are one equally a classic rock band with an unbelievable 8, 9, 10 albums of bangers with no weaknesses. And then
I'd also say Alice
Hendrix, of
Cooper
course,
was almost
Cooper.
almost made my top five.
Yeah, I
Um,
think I sense that you put Zappa in over Cooper specifically because I know what a
yeah,
big Alice Cooper fan. We've talked about that when we first
yep,
met, that you were a big Cooper fan. I
sure.
love Cooper. And I think the Cooper band and the Cooper first solo records until the 80s, all fucking hard to fuck with. They're great. And then he really fell off a fucking cliff until the 90s because of drugs and alcohol. I think Cooper is one of the most interesting people ever. He's almost the reason we, for better or worse, we still have Megadeth. I
Right.
think for better, like the better that Mustaine mostly, got into sobriety because Cooper was his sponsor, his father figure, his,
Golf
got him into
partner. Yeah.
a golf partner, unfortunately also born again Christian. Not a great look or move, but I understand people replace one addiction with another. It's usually a higher power. But Cooper is unbelievable. What's your thoughts on this sort of Cooper revival with most of the original band?
I'm fine with it. I like with Alice Cooper, it's kind of like a weird thing in another band that I would say is in my top 20 would be Kiss, where I like their weird periods. Like I like new wave Alice Cooper, I like disco Kiss, I like cock
Oh
rock
no,
Celtic Frost, I like,
you're just that guy. You're
right.
just that guy.
It's
You are that
it's
one guy. Did Fishbone make a record that wasn't punk or ska? That's the record you like,
right,
I
yeah.
bet. You know what's funny? I love Kiss. Kiss was one of my first loves. I acknowledge that they're not a very good band, right? Like
Great
honestly, not a
songwriters
good band.
though. They're good
Well, they didn't
songwriters.
write most of those songs either. So, like,
Well,
first of all,
they got,
the,
Desmond
the first,
Child is included.
yeah, Desmond C. Child and Michael Bolton and they who what's interesting is so Kiss is a super interesting case, right? They failed upwards. They failed badly. They're for most people have not heard of Ace's pre-Kiss band Molimo, but if you like Molimo and the guitar solos of Molimo, they're all on the first three Kiss records. Most people don't know Peter Chris's attempt at like yacht rock, besides the Peter Chris solo record, which I have a weird affinity for, as my favorite enduringly because the cat was my favorite of the original Kiss members. But all those early Chelsea songs also found their way onto a Kiss record. All the Wicked Lester songs got rewritten for the first three Kiss records, which aren't that great other than a handful of songs. So Kiss is a sort of real interesting case, right? Um, they really helped elevate rock, right? And they failed in strange ways. Like the Elder should have been, if they weren't so fucked up, the Elder should have been like on par with the Wall based on paper. The idea of the story is great. Couple of great songs.
The Oath is
Brendan,
that stands up,
the Oath is great. Bringing in Lou Reed, Bob Ezrin should have been a banger, right?
right?
Failed, failed, failed. So I think Kiss is
Commercially.
super interesting. Well, I think there's parts of it that are really terrible, and then there's a couple of good songs. I would um, but I do love Kiss. Kiss was the first love of my life. Kiss Army since 1977. Kiss Lunchbox. Kiss Makeup. Kiss everything. Um, but they don't compare to the best bands ever. They
Kiss
just
was
don't.
made for
They're
the
not.
80s, though. You have to admit that. Those 80s out Creatures
Yeah,
of the Night rips front to back.
Creatures are yeah. Creatures is great. Then they don't have another
Animalize is
really.
good.
It's good, but it's got some bad shit on it too. And then they're really Hot in the Shade is the worst Kiss record
Oh, yeah.
probably. Even Unmasked is better than
Once
Hot in
we
the
get
Shade.
after Asylum, then I just kind of turn off. I'm good with them
Oh,
up
I
to
love
Asylum.
Revenge. I would say Revenge actually is a little bit of a comeback, and it's mostly written by Gene and Bruce. And I think Revenge actually, okay, it's got terrible corny lyrics and songs, and these 50-year-old men are like, still doing the like, hey little girl, come here. But